sessions of our Talkshow series. This is a part of Faculty of Administrative Science, Universitas Indonesia Open Content Program. My name is Wenda and I'm very happy to lead our today's discussions. In these sessions, we would like to discuss on developmental state, their application and examples in Indonesia context. We are fortunate to have Prof. Harald Fuhr with us today. Prof. Harald is currently a full professor and a chair of International Politics Department, Faculty of Economics and Social Sciences, University of Potsdam, Germany. His background is economic, political science, and public policy. He has an illustrious career on various development agencies such as ADB, World Bank, OECD, UNDP, and so forth, providing advice on the issue of public policy and climate change. The last topic, climate change and sustainability, become his research interest since 2005. To start these sessions, actually we are familiar with your work on the evolution of development thinking. Could you please explain briefly about a historical overview of development paradigm?
It's not easy to summarize development thinking over a longer period. We're talking essentially about 70 years, the late 1940s all the way to today, so 50s to 2018, 2020. There have been different priorities and different phases of thinking. But if you see it from the very end, it has been a long learning process about the development objectives, what is development, etc. And the Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 development goals, Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations have actually summarized what the priorities should be and are, essentially, which is about improving people's lives, the quality of life. So I think after a long journey, we have come to these conclusions that is the objective of overall development. But there were differences throughout the different decades, and I'll summarize them in a couple of seconds. So I think, first of all, we did some research about it. There are different phases where development thinking differed from one to the other. And usually the criteria is the discussions where should we embrace state-led development or market-led development. So the role of the state was an important criteria, and it's differed throughout the decades. And another criteria was essentially outward-looking or inward-looking, or something together, a combination thereof. And if you take these criteria, and including these development objectives, you will have a kind of 5 periods altogether. And the first one is so from the late 1940s, early 50s, all the way to the mid-1960s, where you had industrialization and modernization as the principal objectives all around the world, both with a Western connotation, but also Eastern socialist communist connotation, because we still were living in the Cold War at that time. But both favored state-led development, and rather inward-looking, with minor exceptions, development strategies, so national development strategies, national development planning, in both camps, East and West. Then we had a kind of a more critical phase in the 1960s, starting in the 1960s, triggered partly by criticism from Latin American academics, but also economists and governments, which claimed that maybe we should have a stronger inward-looking strategy and not look too much to the outside. Their argument was we have a dependent development, so the development of developing countries depends on the finances, on the contacts and the philosophy and recommendations of the developed world. So we are dependent on them, so we need to get away, more distance, and de-link ourselves from these strategies. So there's a phase from the 1965 to 1980, more or less, where these priorities are changing. There's also more awareness that development needs to think about poverty and reducing poverty. The World Bank strategy at that time was reducing poverty under McNamara. So it becomes more complex, but still the state had an important role to play in that, and the external environment was regarded as tricky and difficult. So inward-looking state-led development, all the way until 1980s when it changed again. And the third period goes more or less from 1980 to 1990, where a lot of changes happening. China started to move to the market, 1979 under Deng Xiaoping. Yeah, but many other countries also thought that state-led development hasn't brought us any benefit. We need to strengthen markets. This is partly due to the fact that many developing countries were running into deep debt, public debt. They had spent more than they had in terms of revenues over an extended period of time. So the state was regarded as having failed with the developmental promise. So the second phase is a shift to the market. We also had changes in most Western countries. The Reagan and Thatcher governments in the United Kingdom and US also signaled a different approach to market-led development. So you had a kind of a market revolution in the third phase, market liberalism coming in the 1980s until 1990. With the breakdown of communism in 1990, a new phase starts. We don't have a kind of a Cold War environment anymore, and everything is market-led and democracy. So in the 1990s, you have a huge kind of rush into liberal markets and liberal democracies. And globalization, most of our economies globalized in these years, so the idea was rather concentrating on international participation, on globalization, using the benefits of globalization, but also thinking about the quality improvement in the state. The governance debate emerged as well, so it's a more balanced view of state and markets in the 2000s. All the way until maybe 2008, when the financial crisis hit. Yeah, so the period goes from 1990 to 2008 with a more kind of balanced view of state and markets, but still with a very impetus on market forces and globalization. This changed with the financial crisis, and then you had a more cautious review of what market forces and liberalism and liberalization has brought, and more reflection about the role of state and markets came into being in the 2008 to the current phase, which is, it depends, right? There's no general recipe. Each country needs to find its own way between state and market and inward and outward looking. But the development objectives were enshrined 2015 in the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think that's now the preliminary end of development thinking where we are right now.
Yeah, I think it's just interesting when you mention Latin America and China. As we are progressing from the concept into practice, could you please elaborate the development strategies applied in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, or Southeast Asia like China?
Yeah. When we take these criteria, market-led development and kind of the external relations or the domestic versus the international market, I think there are marked differences between Southeast Asia and Latin America. And it's also discussed in the literature about development strategy. So Latin America, for a long time, particularly during the 70s and 80s, preferred inward-looking development strategies and relatively strong state involvement, state intervention in the economy, also with the presence of strong state enterprises in many sectors. So state-led development, state interventionism, but also limited insertion in global markets. While Asia started, and it had led to developmental crises in the region in the decades that came, particularly in the 1980s and 1990s. In Asia, you had a different approach. It also started with an inward-looking development strategy in import substitution and an important role of the state, but then gradually the economies opened up towards global markets and towards global investment. And that has helped to diversify the economy, but also make the enterprises become more competitive. So this combination of inward-looking development and outward-looking became very important in Southeast Asia, opened up their economies towards a more competitive competitive environment and more competition, which gave rise for more efficient, effective enterprises. Right? So I think, and you, of course, finally you have Sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, many countries started with their independence in the 1960s and had lots of trouble and political issues to settle prior to defining development strategies. But by and large, most countries opted for state-led development, right? A rather strong state and inward-looking, you know, with the exception of some who had natural resources to sell. But the state didn't do that very effectively, and it created a lot of societal problems, and the country has still not recovered fully from this period. And so Sub-Saharan Africa is probably a country that has still a lot to catch up in terms of development and learn from others what to do.
Okay.